Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Who are you? I'm Stacy Wallach. Thank you for asking. Still Stacy Wallach, but since this is the last class of this 6-class course, I cannot guarantee that after the course ends, I will still be Stacy Wallach. Thank you to each of you for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. As I was looking, this particular class, I prepared it in rough draft some time ago, and as I was looking over the distance we've come in just 6 classes, 5 classes, it really was impressed on me that we've really covered a lot of ground, and we're going to cover a little more ground today. What we're going to do today is talk about some other accomplishments of President Eisenhower that sometimes get overlooked. Some get entirely overlooked, I must say. And then we're going to have a pop quiz. And then they're all laughing nervously. We're going to have a pop quiz, ladies and gentlemen. And then I'm going to try to sum up, which is not easy. And then I'm going to give you my report card on President Eisenhower, on the issues that we've covered. And I must say that while the presentation, and in particular the report card, was done in draft some months ago, I've changed my grades on him a number of times. And I hope that we have time. In fact, I'm going to move rather rapidly so that we do have time at the end so that you folks can give me your grades. I broke it down because giving a single overall grade to President Eisenhower, maybe any president, is kind of difficult. Because like most complicated people, he has had his ups and downs. But what I find useful about it, even though you might think, well, that's kind of oversimplifying things, is that it forces you to, focus on your own priorities, what you think was really important, not quite so important, where you thought he was really good, but maybe not quite as good as he might have been. So it's a useful exercise, not in the sense that anybody in the outside world is going to care how we grade President Eisenhower, but that it helps focus your own thinking, particularly on your own sense of priorities. So we're going to move rapidly so that we can spend some time with you guys contributing your thoughts. And without further ado, let me get started. I think that we have lost the sense, I'm guessing at this, of how critically important he was in saving the New Deal. And I'm going to get into that in just a second, because I'm guessing, we don't often think of Eisenhower as saving the New Deal. But we'll see in a moment what I mean by that. In this photograph, he's obviously still in the Army. He was in the Army when Roosevelt died, so you're not going to see too many photographs of Ike and FDR in which they're both in civilian clothes. But they had a pretty close relationship. Not as buddies. He wasn't part of FDR's inner circle or FDR's gang. But they worked pretty darn closely during much of World War II, and they had a healthy respect for each other. And it wasn't surprising that once FDR decided that he was going to insist on Marshall staying in Washington, that he picked Eisenhower to run Operation Overlord, the invasion of Western Europe. And the second reason, which I think you'll see in a moment, the second reason that they were pretty close colleagues is that Eisenhower was pretty comfortable with a lot of FDR's policies, which you don't often think of. Yes, they were in sync on some of the most basic strategies of World War II, namely that the most important one being that they both agreed that the principal effort should be the invasion of Europe from England to France to Germany, and the defeat of, the second thing, the defeat of Germany as a priority ahead of defeating Japan. So yes, I think we all knew that they were in sync on those two important things. But I think you're going to discover that they were in sync on quite a few other things. Had Ohio Senator Robert Taft been the Republican nominee, and you'll recall from the first class, but for Eisenhower, he would have been the Republican nominee in 1952. And had he won the presidency, his first goal would have been to repeal the New Deal. Now, the reason I know that his first goal would have been to repeal the New Deal is because he said so. There's nothing subtle about what Senator Taft and his very substantial wing of the Republican Party were all about. And you might think, well, you know, he never would have won the presidency. That's not so sure. Had Eisenhower not agreed to run under the Republican banner, Truman would have run for re-election. And the South probably would have exited from the Democratic Party, as they had in '48. And with that split between Southern Democrats running as Dixiecrats again, and a very unpopular Truman, who by 1952 was saddled with the Korean War, was saddled with a bunch of corruption scandals, was saddled with charges that he was soft on communism. Taft could have been elected. I mean, I can't predict a future that didn't happen, but it's not at all unreasonable to think that he would have come in. And as I say, he said very plainly that his principal goal as president would have been to repeal the New Deal. And when he would have tried that, he would have been joined by an awful lot of conservative members of Congress from both parties. So it could have happened. Remember, there was a huge section of the country that was always opposed to the New Deal. But more importantly, by 1952, the Democratic Party had been in power for 20 years, and there was just a natural reaction in the voting public at large that 20 years was enough. And so it's very hard to feel optimistic about what would have happened to basic New Deal programs had Taft been elected. It would have been very different, that's for sure. So when Eisenhower was swept into office in '52, in November of '52, he had big coattails. He brought in a lot of Republicans with him, and they took majorities in both houses of Congress. And the Republicans who were elected, on the whole, were a lot more conservative than Ike himself was. A lot more. They were ideological Republicans, as opposed to Eisenhower, who was, you know, sort of a romantic Republican. Remember, up until January of '52, he had never voted. He had never identified himself with either party. Truman had twice asked him, once in '48 and once in '52, to run on the Democratic ticket. Truman thought it was as likely as not that he would be happy as a Democrat. And it could have gone either way. But the Republicans who were elected in '52 and took control of both houses of Congress, they were ideological Republicans. I don't say that as a criticism. I say these were, you know, professional politicians who got elected on the Republican ticket, and a lot of them were quite conservative. GOP senators proposed 107 constitutional amendments specifically designed to repeal the New Deal. This is no small matter. Several GOP proposals were designed to reverse the result of the Civil War, expressly. And notice, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not talking about Southern Democrats, I'm talking about the GOP. They wanted to create state supremacy over federal law. And they were not shy about it. Partly you have to understand that, I'll read it for you. Ike's opposition to his own party was critical in defeating these proposals, some of which had strong support. We'll get to that in a moment. What you have to understand is the Republicans had been out of power so long, right, and had been defeated so often, 5 times in presidential elections, that it took them quite a while to get used to the idea that they were now the majority party. I know that sounds crazy, but it's clear from what a number of leading Republicans said that they couldn't get accustomed to the fact that they were now the governing party. And you'll see that in a moment. And in addition, some of the specific steps they did take, for example, passing a constitutional amendment limiting the president to 2 terms, that was pure reaction against Roosevelt and fear that he was going to emerge from the grave and defeat them again. And partly it's Roosevelt's fault. Roosevelt, among many other wonderful qualities, delighted in terrorizing the Republicans, in humiliating them, in making fun of them at any opportunity. He had a joie de vivre when it came to party politics that we've kind of lost since then. Let me read this to you. This is Ike speaking about the New Deal early in 1954, hardly a year in office. Quote, "Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Their number is negligible, and they are stupid." Close quote. And when Ike spoke those words in 1954, a synonym for that so-called tiny splinter group was his own Republican Party. That's what he was talking about. And let me tell you, that came as a shock to the Republican Party. Here was Mr. Republican who swept them into office for the first time in 20 years, and he turns around and he's FDR Jr. But there's another aspect of this that I think is incredibly important for us to realize when we think about his silence on civil liberties and McCarthyism and his silence on civil rights. His speech demonstrated beyond doubt Ike's ability and willingness to speak out with great clarity and force on issues that he felt passionately. He knew all about the bullied pulpit of the presidency, and he knew how to use it when he wanted to. Now, on a separate issue that he faced literally on the first day of the new Congress in January of '53 was under the leadership of Ohio Senator John Bricker. He was faced with a constitutional amendment that would have made all foreign treaties that any United States government entered into revisable by Congress and ineffective until Congress passed enabling legislation. I mean, that's an example of what I mean by they hadn't gotten over FDR and Truman, the 20 years of the Democrats running the show, and most of all, it hadn't dawned on them that the guy sitting up at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue was a Republican. They wanted to take the treaty power away from the president. And he had 63 co-sponsors plus himself. In other words, when the bill was introduced in the Senate, he had 64 votes, enough for it to pass as a constitutional amendment, and then it has to be sent to the states. So it looked like he was in. It looked like Bricker was going to get his amendment, and he had a lot of support. To give you a sense of the thrust of, I won't say anti-New Deal politics, but sort of counterweight shifting, the whole country moving off to the right. The Bricker Amendment was endorsed by the American Bar Association, by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, by the American Legion, by the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the Daughters of the American Revolution. Most of the nation's newspapers and Congressional Mail was running 9-1 in favor of Bricker's amendment. This was no minor deal. They were going to take the treaty power away from the president. Indeed, as we'll see in a moment, a leading constitutional scholar, when brought in as a consultant, said, you're going to destroy the ability of the country to enter into any treaties. You can picture sitting down at the table with the foreign minister of some other country, and there's the Secretary of State, and the foreign minister says to the Secretary of State, well, where's the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee? There's no point in talking just to you. And that foreign minister would have been right. There would have been no point talking to just the Secretary of State. It would have essentially destroyed America's ability to participate fully in world affairs, which is exactly what Bricker had in mind. And he was not shy about telling you that. Three men worked together to defeat Bricker, and amazingly, they succeeded. Remember, they were faced on the opening of Congress with 64 senators co-sponsoring the legislation. First of all, let's identify who John W. Davis is. He was a New York lawyer. He was the head of a law firm that all of you lawyers should know, Davis, Polk & Wardwell, which was then and is today one of the leading law firms in the country. He was the Democratic nominee for President of the United States in 1924. He was chosen on something like the 3,452nd ballot. I'm exaggerating a little bit, ladies and gentlemen. Not because he of any problem with himself. He wasn't really a candidate to begin with. The Democratic convention in 1924 was deadlocked among several candidates. He was the compromise when they were just about ready to give up and agreed to be the candidate as a compromise because they couldn't agree on who they wanted. He was a leading New York lawyer, and at this very moment was representing the Board of Education of the city of Topeka in Brown against Board. He represented the board and took it on pro bono, publico, for the good of the public, and that is no fee. And one of the examples of Eisenhower's initial naivete about Washington politics, not about politics in general, but about Washington politics, was he had some sort of social affair at the White House with a lot of people, and he invited both Davis and the new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, and tried to get them together. He had them sit at the same table and came over and tried to get them to talk about compromising Brown against Board. Both Warren and Davis instantly understood that Eisenhower was completely out to lunch, did not understand how totally inappropriate that was, and they said their goodbyes and went on their separate ways. But he came in to warn Eisenhower that this Bricker Amendment, number one, was a terrible thing for the country, no matter what party you belong to, and number two, that it was very close to being passed. They brought in, do we have any lawyers in the audience? They brought in a guy named Corwin. Remember Corwin on contracts? Well, Corwin was also, in his prime, a constitutional scholar. He was well known during the prime of his career as a constitutional scholar as for contracts. He wrote, for you non-lawyers, he wrote the great textbook on contracts that many of us had to study. And they went to Johnson, who was the majority leader, but the brand new majority leader.
Minority leader.
I don't have minority leader. Thank you, Phil. Thank you. He was the minority leader in the Senate. And they had a little coffee klatch, the four of them, with Corwin. And Eisenhower and Johnson understood for the first time that this was really a devastating thing that was about to happen. Johnson then did one of his incredibly sophisticated ploys that I'm not going to describe in detail because it takes a while, and ran circles around Bricker and his 63 co-sponsors and managed to get the thing defeated. And it's a fascinating story. You can read about it in any number of places. But it was the first time, after all, as Phil just pointed out, he was not the majority leader, he was the minority leader. He still ran circles around everybody, both procedurally, substantively. And remember that picture of Johnson doing the famous lean in? That's what defeated it. His ability to persuade people. I use the word persuade in quotes, and trade-offs, patronage, pork, all of the ploys that a master of the Senate could use, Johnson used, because he really understood, after this coffee clutch they had, listening to Professor Corwin, that this was a terrible thing that was going to happen to the United States, and he defeated it.
Stacy, question?
Yes.
It takes 2/3 of the Senate to get an amendment on its way. But what about the House? Was the House going to be a shoo-in?
Yes. You have to take my word on that. The reason you can take my word on it is the 3 history books I read about this that mentioned it, they all said that the House was already committed because they had had a previous vote, I think the year before, and there were more than enough votes in the House of Representatives. But you're absolutely right, it has to be in both houses. So on another subject, to the extent that he had any real economic understanding of how the national economy works, and I question how much understanding he had at the outset. I think by the time he left the presidency, he had a pretty good understanding. He believed in a balanced federal budget, but unlike almost every other president in the 20th century and in the 21st century, he was more than willing to cut the defense budget in order to get an overall balanced federal budget because after 40 years in the Army, he felt very comfortable with cutting significant pieces out of the military budget when he thought it wasn't necessary. Quote, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. Close quote. Ike's words, FDR's voice. I think no president has ever said it better. But unlike every other president of the 20th century, Ike acted. And as I've told you before, by June of '55, Ike had shrunk the Army from 1.5 million men to 1 million. He had shrunk the Navy and the Marines from 1 million to 870,000. The Air Force he grew slightly because that was part of his new look of strategic nuclear brinksmanship. And had he had his way, he would have cut more. But in his second term, there were other things that came up. This was a guy who was willing to put his mouth where your money was, namely cut defense spending that he thought was pointless. And with help from Wilson on the left, the Defense Secretary, and Treasury Secretary George Humphrey, he balanced the federal budget in '55, in '56, and again in '60 and '61. Pretty substantial accomplishment. Because if you're a Keynesian economist like me, because that's what I was taught in school, so naturally that's what I know, right? He balanced the federal budget at the right time. The 50s in general, with one real exception, was an expansive economy. And in an expansive economy, it's a perfectly appropriate time to run surpluses. But a downside of Ike's and Dulles' new look policy of nuclear brinksmanship was that he spent a lot of money on nuclear armaments, and that's why he ran deficits in 57, 58, and 59. You know from prior classes that my real problem with his approach wasn't that he ran federal budget deficits. I have to say, because there's no point in my trying to hide it, the whole concept of using nuclear brinksmanship as your basic diplomatic policy is, in my opinion, sheer lunacy. Not wrong, lunatic, just complete madness. But if you remember, I think it was in our second class, that's what he and Dulles said. But what they really did was create all of these treaties, NATO, CENTO, CETO, the ANZUS treaty, and surround Russia and China with organizations of states opposed to the spread of Soviet-style communism. And in fact, all of their pre-election rhetoric about rolling back communism was just that, rhetoric. Remember, there was East Germany, there was Poland, there was Hungary. They never rolled back anything. So there was this wonderful dissonance between what they said publicly and what they actually did on the ground. And what they did was actually a continuation of the Truman policy of containment. And number one, it kept the peace. And number two, you could argue that it worked. By the way, you'll remember that at that time I said that one of the strongest things I can say positively about Eisenhower is that he's the only 20th century two-term president who never sent us to war. And that's true, ladies and gentlemen, but I played a little trick on you. So take a second and think about that. He was the only 20th century two-term president who didn't send the United States to war. Remember, at the beginning, he inherited Korea, and he got us out of Korea in a few months. But there's a trick in that. What I told you is the literal truth.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
One of the tricks is that he financed the French in Indochina, which of course led to our
Yeah,
involvement
that's
in
true,
Vietnam.
but it goes further than that. Yes, sir.
Roosevelt's first two terms.
Correct.
Three.
There was a four-term president in the 20th century whose first two terms were without war. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. How many of you knew this about Eisenhower? He expanded Social Security in 1954 to cover 10 million additional U.S. citizens, in particular farmers and self-employed professionals like doctors, lawyers, dentists, any self-employed professional. Engineers, definitely engineers. Any self-employed professional. 10 million people added to Social Security. Again, this is a guy who's more in line with FDR than you might have suspected. And believe me, when I say he expanded it, yes, Congress had to act, but he drove this through Congress. He increased Social Security benefits by 16%. And the only reason that I've included this is a photograph of an IBM punch card before, when it was done mechanically, right? Right? This is January 9, 1937, and they're just about to get underway. But the marvelous thing about it is that this is all done mechanically, these little holes. Oh my, but you know what? It worked. Absolutely, it worked. Ike persuaded Congress to raise the federal minimum wage by 1/3. Does that sound like a Republican? By the way, just in case somebody asks you today your opinion on raising the federal minimum wage, the federal minimum wage has never raised a family of four above the official poverty line, and it has never kept pace with inflation except for the year 1967. So if you believe that there are, and you might not, but if you believe that there ought to be a federal minimum, you might think about why we don't have a federal minimum that at least puts a family of 4 at the poverty line. And by the way, you might conclude that there are very good reasons not to do that, but you at least ought to think about it and then speak up. When Dr. Jonas Salk and his team, there was a team, believe me, developed the vaccine against polio, Ike got behind it immediately and insisted it be delivered free to all American children living below the poverty line. Now you'll see here that Salk shared it free of charge. That is, he didn't charge a license fee for his invention, but to manufacture it and distribute it and deliver it, that costs money. That costs a lot of money. And Eisenhower, here he is with Salk on the right, just immediately said, children who can't, families who can't afford to get it should get it for free, and he got Congress to agree. Oh, just like this typical teenager who, couldn't afford it, but he got it for free. By the way, this is just a marvelous photograph, but even better is, look at this grin over here on this, I assume a nurse. She's got a hand on the famous body. Right, you see this right here? She is just a happy lady. Very happy lady.
That could be his mother, because she went with him everywhere.
Oh, yes. That could, you could be right. You could be right. Ike created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and appointed Ovida Hobby to head it. Ovida Hobby, by the way, was an incredibly effective executive organizer, a politician from Texas, I believe. She was terrific at what she did. Ike was, in the forefront of getting this whole thing organized and part of, a significant cabinet level appointment. His first instruction to Hobby was to design a national healthcare system, similar to what he'd had all his life in the U.S. Army.
And it went nowhere.
Wonder why, huh? By the way, when Congress nixed it, he then proposed a federal reinsurance plan for private insurance companies if they would extend their health care insurance programs to all Americans. In other words, they said, you insure everybody who comes, and if there's an extra risk pool that you're taking on, we'll backstop it with a federal reinsurance plan so that if your losses in that pool are greater than your normal losses, we'll back it up. We'll reimburse you. Pretty good, huh? Congress nixed that. It was defeated in the House of Representatives by his own party. 75 Republicans voted no, and that was the winning margin for defeating the proposal. And the AMA, which is a little different today than it was then, the AMA opposed it as, quote, the opening wedge to socialized medicine, unquote. I believe the AMA has taken a slightly different position, so let's not be too quick to condemn the current leadership of the AMA. Truman created the National Institutes of Health, but it was a tiny program until Ike came along and increased its funding from $59 million in 1953 to $560 million in 1961. Does this sound like a conservative Republican to you?
And Nixon even increased it more.
Yes, he did. Using the Soviets' launch of Sputnik as a goad, Ike persuaded a reluctant Congress, and I assure you it was very reluctant, in 1958 to fund basic scientific research in many different fields, arguing it's critical to national defense. That was the argument that worked in a number of fields, and it set an important precedent for government-funded research that continues to this day. And to this day, even conservatives are willing to admit, in fact, happy to admit, that a lot of good things have come out of government research. They don't mind the government funding research. They think, though, that once the research has accomplished something, it should be handed off to free enterprise, to private enterprise, which is, a perfectly defensible point of view. But it was Ike who started. Of course, there had been research during World War II, but it came to an end as an institutionalized thing after the end of World War II. Ike said, no, this should be a permanent part of the federal government. He created the President's Science Advisory Committee, which was the first post-war direct White House link to the U.S. scientific community in peacetime, and named this guy, Dr. James Killian, the president of MIT, to lead it. And I think it has a slightly different name today, but it's continued ever since Eisenhower started it, and is an important piece of the president's access to the civilian scientific community. And we approved. Yes, indeed. We thought this was great. Beginning in 55, you didn't recognize me? Take another look. See? You see the resemblance? But I was much younger. Yeah. Beginning in 55, Ike pressed Congress to fund public school construction by the states. Congress refused. So again, using Sputnik as a scare tactic, a national defense emergency. He was very effective at this, by the way. He persuaded Congress to pass the 1958 National Defense Education Act, which a number of people in this room may be familiar with. I'm certainly familiar with it. It funded improved public school instruction in science, math, and foreign languages, which we still could use a lot more, particularly foreign languages. And it made college tuition loans and graduate program grants and fellowships. And it was a very important piece of young people growing up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. In 1954, in November, the Democrats won back majorities in both the Senate and the House. And now in red, I'm putting my own personal opinion. I believe that Eisenhower was more relieved by that than anybody else in the government, because he found it impossible to deal with his own Republican Party on a number of issues that he felt strongly about. And here are the two guys that he spent the next 6 years working with. And although they didn't agree, this is, of course, Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn, and Eisenhower and the two of them didn't agree on everything. But what's remarkable is how many things they did agree on and how closely and well they worked together. Yes, ma'am?
It seems to me that all this stuff cost an awful lot of money that he's doing. What was his, how did he look at taxes?
Well, he had a tax system that wasn't so radically different from ours today. It was a little higher on the high end. In fact, there was a 90% top bracket. But there were very few people who paid the 90%. Very few. And remember, it's only on the... When you're in the 90% bracket, that doesn't mean you pay 90% of the first dollar you earn. That means you pay 90% of the last dollars you earn above the thing. The most important part of it, and this is a very good question, and we just don't have time to get into it. The most important part of his ability to have balanced budgets, etc., was that the national economy was expanding so enormously that whatever tax rates were generating enough revenue to pay for all of this. Plus, he cut an enormous part of the defense budget out. When you go from 1.5 million men in the Army to 1 million men, it is a gargantuan sum. It's a fabulous question, which leads me to point out to you all this. Including today, we're spending almost 12 hours on Eisenhower. That's a lot of time. We're barely scratching the surface. And this lady's point, which is a very valid point and is worth talking about, we can't talk about. We have to keep moving because we don't have time. Another major Eisenhower accomplishment, the St. Lawrence Seaway. And here is Duluth, Minnesota, in the middle of the upper Midwest. And you go through Lake Superior, through the Sioux Canal and locks that had been built, then down through Lake Huron, through the Welland Canal into Lake Erie, and then up into Lake Ontario, and then the whole distance out the St. Lawrence River, out into the Atlantic Ocean, and then either down to East Coast ports or off to Europe. 2,500 miles, 14 locks, large ship capability, and absolutely vital to opening the Midwest to the world. And notice I said the Midwest. If I'd had room on the slide, I would have said the US and Canadian Midwests. This was absolutely critical for Canada. Here's the guy who dreamed it up. Narcisse Cantin, or Cantin, how would you pronounce it? Cantin. 1870 to 1940, an absolute dreamer promoter who never got anywhere with it whatsoever. The only thing he created was a lot of children. He was very good at that. And yet the idea stuck. From Teddy Roosevelt onward, every president in the 20th century was in favor of building the St. Lawrence Seaway, but either lack of money or World War I and then World War II, or governmental opposition, sometimes in America, sometimes in Canada. It never got off the ground. American railroads opposed it because they thought it would divert traffic from the railroads. And as a matter of fact, they were right. Gulf Coast port operators were absolutely opposed to it because they liked the idea of barges coming down the Mississippi to Gulf port coastal ports. Appalachian coal mine owners were opposed to it because what it was opening up was coal from Canada and coal from the upper Midwest. And the United Mine Workers were opposed to it because they thought it would impact the coal mines where their men worked. And one guy in particular was opposed to it. One guy, more than anybody else, who was able to just put up his hand for a long time and say, stop. John Lewis. Now, is this a face that only a mother could love? He is as a much younger man. I looked at easily 100 photographs of him on the internet taken over 50 years. In not one of them was he smiling. This is one tough cookie. There's a fascinating history of the United Mine Workers of how some of the key early players in the formation of the Union were members of the Communist Party, not in the sense that they were Soviet spies. They were members of the American Communist Party who were very active in helping to form labor unions, and how John Lewis, at a given point, understood that anti-communism was becoming such a force in America that if he was going to continue to build his union, he was going to have to get rid of the communists who were officials and many of the locals and who were very active and dedicated union members and union leaders. The manner in which he got rid of all of the communists from the United Mine Workers is accurately reflected in this face. He's one tough guy. In 1952, the Canadian Prime Minister, Louis Saint Laurent, asserted, out of pure frustration with this 50-year history of everybody saying, what a good idea it is, but nobody ever gets it done, he said, all right, we're going to just build it and operate it on our own. And that was very effective. Ike used that threat in 1954 to persuade the new Congress, the Democratic Party-controlled Congress, that it's time to appropriate the money. And they entered into a treaty with Canada to build and operate the Seaway. And started in 54, opened in 59. The Seaway, and by the way, one of the arguments he used, that Eisenhower used, was that when he went to Congress in late 54, it looked like the American economy was starting to slide into a recession. It looked that way. Turned out it was right. And he argued that it would provide many thousands of construction jobs at exactly the time that it was needed, and permanent jobs in the Midwest industries and mines and farms. And this picture gives you a sense, a small sense, of just what a gargantuan undertaking. This is one of the locks being built. There were 14 of them. This was just a huge, huge undertaking. Here are two members of the working class stepping off the Royal Yacht Britannia for the opening ceremonies in June of 59. The two of them got along famously, as a matter of fact. He knew her well from his time in England, and both before she was queen. Queen Elizabeth and Ike were pals. Because, as you can see, the young Elizabeth was a very strikingly handsome young lady. And as Gene Edward Smith told me in a telephone call, when I was talking to him about a couple of things, and Kay Summersby just happened to come up, he said, what, are you kidding me? He was a skirt chaser his entire life. And I didn't ask him for a footnote on that, but I assume that Professor Smith knew whereof he spoke. Whether he was a skirt chaser or just appreciated very bright, very athletic, very good-looking young women, well, sure. 2,000 ships a year carry 50 million metric tons of cargo through the Seaway. It's probably even more today. This is this particular statistic was taken during the downturn. I think it's either a 2008 or 9 statistic, so it's probably more today. However you describe or measure the St. Lawrence Seaway, it is a huge deal. It is a very, very big deal for both countries. Here's a ship coming through the locks that you saw being constructed. There are also bridges, because it's also used, by the way, for entertainment. You can take a cruise ship. I won't mention any specific names, but you can take a wonderful cruise up the St. Lawrence Seaway and see a great deal of gorgeous scenery. And for every other imaginable recreational use, the Seaway Authority has promoted, whether it's fishing or water skiing or hiking. I mean, there is just an enormous array of benefits that have come from the Seaway, not least of which, and I cannot emphasize this enough, that it helped bind Canada and the U.S. together in friendship and peace. Remember, up until the beginning of the 20th century, our relationship with the Canadians over the previous 200 years had not been all that wonderful. We tried to invade them. We actually invaded them 3 different times. We thought that once we gave them the opportunity, they would love to be part of the United States, and we were kind of shocked when it turned out they weren't that excited about becoming part of the United States. So the very, very warm friendship and the peaceful relations that we've had with the Canadians for the last 113 years is something we should not take for granted. And I say this, for example, in connection with the, is it called the XL pipeline? Keystone pipeline that they want to build to bring oil from Canadian oil tar sands down to the Gulf ports on the Gulf Coast. And environmentally, it raises a lot of issues. It may be that a lot of the environmental issues can be solved, but it raises a lot of issues for environmentalists who say we shouldn't be encouraging oil to be made from tar sands because in Canada it's going to be terribly polluting. And they may be right about that, but when you think about how critical to our national security and our national interest our peace, our real peace with Canada is, my only point is we should be very careful before we reject something that Canada has said for 10 years now is so important to it. We may be technically correct, that is, environmentalists may be technically correct that taking oil from tar sands is not a good idea, but it's the Canadians who have decided that it is a good idea. And all I'm saying, hang on one second, all I'm saying is not that we should be for it or against it. I have no opinion on that whatsoever. What I'm saying is we should be very slow to reject something that Canada feels is so important to it. Yes, sir?
Well, Canadians are talking about going west with their oil and send it to China if we say no.
Yes, they're going to do it whether we take it or not. But again, my point is not to speak to the substance of whether we should agree to this pipeline or not. My point to you is that, well, let me use just myself. My point is that when I think about Canada, I just take it for granted that they love us and we love them, right? and we shouldn't take it for granted.
As they
We-
say, it's the longest undefended frontier in the world.
In the world, let me repeat that. It is the longest undefended frontier in the world. And it's like a marriage, a long marriage. You build it day by day. You work at it. A great marriage doesn't happen by accident. You work on it, right? You build it. You make compromises. Tell me about it. Who said that? Bob, who said that? Did you get a voice that came in from outside? All I can tell you is that we ought to think this through very, very, very carefully, because Canada is really critical to us. All right, what else? The Eisenhower Interstate System. Here's a typical highway in 1910. And by the way, obviously I have selected a few photographs, but
Accentuate your points.
right. But this is absolutely typical of 1910. In 1916 and 1921, Woodrow Wilson, of all people, sponsored the first significant federal financial aid to state highways. In 1916, he got Congress to appropriate $75 million to give to the states on a matching fund basis. That is, the state would have to put up an equal amount to start building state highways. In 1921, for the first time, they wrote in a provision to encourage the states to think about at each state's borders, connecting it up with the next state next to them. And as you'll recall from our first class, a young Captain Eisenhower led an army convoy across the continent on the so-called Lincoln Highway. You remember the photographs I showed you of the Lincoln Highway. And to say the least, it was a sobering experience. Here's a typical highway in 1926. And by the way, I didn't edit this. This was typical in 1926. Here's another highway in 1935. This is for real. All during the 20s and 30s, Robert Moses of New York built parkways throughout New York State. And the rest of the country's governors were jealous. They couldn't figure out, how can New York do this? Because there was only one Robert Moses. And who was the governor from 1928 to 1932? FDR, who watched very, very carefully and worked with Robert Moses and saw firsthand the benefit of all of those, quote, superhighways, unquote, that Moses was building.
What about the CCC?
And in 1939, he had, as president, Roosevelt had the chief of the U.S. Bureau of Public Roads write a report called Toll Roads and Free Roads. It was essentially the first time anybody had put down in writing what an interstate highway system across the United States would look like. Truman was supportive, but he had other priorities. Even Truman, though, got Congress to appropriate $25 million for initial design studies. But it was Ike who got the project fully funded by Congress and actually underway in 1956. And again, you'll see the role that national defense plays. Ike, I think, remembered his 1919 trip across the U.S., but far more important, from World War II, he saw firsthand German autobahns, which were essentially for Germany an interstate highway system, and he saw how the Germans were able to use it to move troops around from the various fronts. And he was deeply, deeply impressed by that. And he also wanted to boost employment because he saw that it looked like the U.S. was heading towards recession. So he got his friend, retired General Lucius Clay, and it was the only time that Clay agreed to do something governmentally. Remember, Clay had retired from the Army after World War II, went into business, became an extremely successful business executive, first with American Can Company, and then ultimately he became the chairman of Lehman Brothers. But Ike leaned on him to take this task on because he was such an effective planner and organizer, and Eisenhower knew a good planner and organizer when he saw it. And here he is signing the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act, right, of 1956. And part of Ike's justification for the enormous expense was this. if and when the Soviets dropped nuclear bombs on U.S. cities, the Interstates would enable its residents to evacuate those cities before the bombs fell. He knew it was crazy. He knew, believe me, he knew. But he got Congress. Yeah, we gotta do this. Everyone who had a brain in their heads understood that the real rationale was jobs, jobs, and jobs. And work got underway immediately and lasted well into the 1990s. Now, here's an interesting example of Ike and the Democratic-controlled Congress reaching an effective compromise. Eisenhower and his folks wanted to finance it with long-term government bonds paying 3%, so that it would never impact the annual federal budgets, but it would be financed over a very long period of time and also provide a good investment for people like us. 3% bonds, but with complete security. 3% in the 1950s wasn't such a bad return.
Not so bad today.
The Democrats, interestingly enough, yes, thank you very much. Not so bad today, yes. Let's move right past that before I start to cry. The Democrats were in favor of Ike's proposal to build the interstates, but they were vehement that it should be paid out of each current budget each year, because it would allow it to come back to Congress each year. And they had a real standoff. Then Eisenhower and the Democratic leadership sat down literally in the White House over scotch, and they agreed on a 4.5 cent per gallon gasoline tax as the way of financing it. Today, it's 18.5 cents, of which 2.5 cents goes for urban mass transit systems. And you might say, well, why isn't 17.75 cents going for urban mass transit systems? And the answer is, I don't know. But here you can see, this gives you the tiniest taste of how many jobs were created. Long-term, good, solid jobs. And let me say, skilled jobs, like engineers, things like that, semi-skilled jobs, unskilled jobs. This was an incredible, just like the St. Lawrence Seaway. The two projects together created massive long-term employment for all kinds of people. These boys were shovel-ready out in Missouri. They were very proud of the fact that they were the first. Actually, this is very controversial. There are 2 or 3 other states who claim to be the first, but they got their sign up first. And they weren't kidding about shovel-ready. That's what they... And occasionally things got fairly complex. This is it's Los Angeles, yes, of course. But by the way, there are photographs just like this from other parts of the country.
Oh, yes. It's on my GPS. It looks like spaghetti.
And as they say in the movies, build it and they will come. But I have an even better saying. If we can build it, we can congest it. By the way, if the magazine from which I took this off of the net is accurate, and that's a big if, this is not like there was a big accident and the highway got closed suddenly. This is the morning rush hour. That's what they said.
Back when that was being built, gasoline costs about $0.25 a gallon. So a 4.5% tax, or 4.5 cent tax, was a 20% tax.
Did everybody hear that? That's a very valid point. Now, we'll talk about this in a minute because we're going to take a break for a pop quiz here. But
Cars were only getting 7 miles to the gallon.
Yeah.
that's right. That's right. All very well taken. You all know that the two-digit numbers for interstate highways that are even indicate roads that are going east and west. and the two-digit numbers that are odd, go north and south. And do you all know what the three-digit numbers mean? Oh, you're going to love this quiz. You're going to love this quiz. So yes, the three-digit numbers equal what do you call it?
Beltways.
The roads that go around the city, either entirely or a half curve or spurs. Yes, I had a spur. Oh yeah, right. See this spur? Interstate 27 down here in Texas. All right. So we're going to divide up the room. All right, you ready? From my point of view, there's the left front and the left rear, the right front and the right rear. So we'll try to get answers from each of the quadrants before we go. Are you ready? Okay. We'll start with the left front. Just call it out. What's the number of the longest interstate in the United States?
66.
90.
Who said 90? 90 is right. You know it starts in Boston, but where does it end?
Seattle.
No. Who?
San Francisco.
No. Yeah, you guys, hey, it's not your turn yet. It's not your turn. We're going to get to you. Who over here said Seattle? You're right. Now, last time for the left front quadrant. So I-90 is the longest. It goes from Boston to Seattle. In round numbers, how long is it?
3,800 miles.
3,800? Wrong. No. You were in the right direction. If we were playing hide and seek, I'd say you're warm. Front quadrant. Anybody?
3,000.
Yeah, you're right. It's 3,020 miles. So you're absolutely right. Okay? So the longest is I-90, which is right here. Right?
My house is right here.
Right. Now,
He's famous for that.
Now, left rear quadrant. You guys ready back there? The longest north-south interstate. Hold on. This is for the left. I can't hear you. 95 it is. All right. Now, let me ask the easy question first. What's its southern end? Miami. Remember, this is just for the rear left. Miami. But where does it start up north? Hey, guys, can you wait your turn? We're in the left rear here. Yeah, it starts in Maine. Do you know what village, town, or city?
Bangor.
No, because
All right, I'll throw it open to the whole floor. Where is the city, town, or village that it starts in Maine?
Bangor.
Caribou, Maine. No, it goes past
All
Bangor.
right, forget it. I'm not going to torture you because I never heard of this place, and I doubt that anybody else has. It starts in a place in Maine called Hulton. Hulton. Oh, you knew! This guy knew. Stand up and take a bow.
You can smell Holton when you're getting pretty close.
All right, we're now, thank you very much. Oh, by the way, wait, one more question for the rear left. How long is I-95?
3,500.
Call it out.
1,800.
All right, you're very close. Somebody said 2,000. It's 1,920 miles. 1,920 miles. All right. Now we're coming to these eager beavers over here, the front right.
The big mouths.
All right. So we've got I-90 and I-95. All right. So here's a tough one for these eager guys over here in the front right. The longest interstate or section of an interstate within a single state. So it would be either the whole one or a portion of an interstate, but the longest one within one state. Wrong. Thank you very much. Right here, Texas. Right? Do you know the name of it? I-10. That's correct. And how long is it inside of Texas? I would have said 1,000. That's a little too long. It's actually 879 miles from one end of Texas to the other. I-10. We'll go back and we'll take a look at it. All right? Now, right rear. What state has the most interstates, the most different interstates inside the state?
Illinois.
Hey, are you in the right side of the room? You guys are the best. Right rear, the most interstates inside of one state.
Illinois.
No, I would have said New York.
Ohio?
Oh, wait a minute. What did you say, sir?
California?
Wrong. New York is right. Who said New York? New York, this lady right here. All right, now, miss, how many are inside New York? Take a guess? All right, I'll open it up to the whole floor. How many?
6, 7.
You are so right.
29.
My Lord, you're right.
I'm a New York State.
How did you know that?
I'm a New York State.
Ah, yes indeed. Let's hear it. Don't ever play trivia for money with this lady. All right, now, here's a question. Where are we, in the right rear? Or did we do the right rear? Did we do the right rear yet? All right, so we're back to the left front. The total mileage of all interstates inside of a single state. The total mileage of all the interstates inside of one state. Who's got the most? Anybody want to say?
3,000 miles.
He's very close. Phil Halpern just said 3,000. The correct answer is 3,233. You're absolutely right. What state?
It's got to be New York.
Texas. The right answer. Who said Texas? Ah, yes indeed. Yes indeed. Okay. All right. All right, now, left rear. Left rear. Now, this you're going to have to get both parts right. All right. What interstate has the heaviest daily automobile volume? The most cars on the interstate per day. We're in the right, we're in the left rear.
I-5 California.
Definitely California, and you got the I part correct. What city do you think it's in? Los Angeles. All right. Anybody want to take anybody in the room want to take a guess? Round numbers. What's the daily volume?
Too many.
That's the correct number. Too many, right? Nobody knows? All right, I'm going to put it up.
405.
It's 374,000 vehicles a day on I-405. I must admit, I've done a little driving in Los Angeles. I don't remember that one. All right? Now, here's an easy one. I'll throw it open to the room, and I'll take a round number. What is the total mileage of the total interstate system? That's very straightforward.
30,000. 14,000.
What did you say?
14,000.
14? Not even close. 30?
30.
You're warm, sir. 40? Excuse me? You're ice cold. 40,000 is really warm. Yes, ma'am. Excuse me?
48,000.
Here's the winner. Stand up and take a bow. 47,182. That's a lot of miles. Okay?
Two of them are not under repair.
Ah, that's two of the same number. That's a good question. What's the answer?
It has one number north and another number west.
But it's all 87, isn't it?
No, it's 90, it's
90.
90 going north, 87 going west.
No, it's 87 going north south,
Okay,
87 and 90.
87 and 90.
okey doke.
Somebody behind me wants to know how many miles are being repaired.
And the answer to that I can give you, 47,182.
Thank you.
Now, moving on. In his farewell speech in March of 1961, and Lord only knows why he waited so long, Ike warned us against the dangers of our military-industrial complex. That's what he said in the speech, but that's not what he wrote. And the difference between what he wrote and originally intended to say and the words he actually spoke are enormous. I'll get to that in 1 second. The two major points he made in the speech, and the speech is worth reading from beginning to end. You can get it on the internet with 2 clicks. Speaking of the Soviet Union and China, in 1961, he said, "We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method." Now, he did not foresee that the Soviet Union would collapse of its own internal contradictions. But that was his view in 1961. And speaking of our own domestic institutions, as I just quoted to you, he said, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex." Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot emphasize too much the importance of what I'm now going to share with you. He spoke those words, but what he wrote in the speech and apparently changed his mind was that what we need to be careful about was, quote, "the military-industrial congressional complex," unquote. And what a world of difference once you realize what he's talking about. Because the critical component, of course, was the ability of the industrial complex to influence congressional elections and congressmen and women, and the ability of the military to scare the Congress. That's one of the things that Eisenhower was most upset about, the ability of the various military services to think only of their own service rather than the overall national interest, and to scare the living daylights out of Congress into appropriating what Eisenhower felt were inappropriate sums.
But that's how he got his major bills passed, by scaring them and using
Correct.
national defense.
As I said, it would have been nice if he'd given this speech a little earlier. But remember the speech that he gave much earlier, that remember every gun, every missile, every rocket is taking food out of the mouths of our children. He concluded that January 61 farewell to us with these words, quote, "Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together." Now, just before we get to his report card, how are we doing? All right, you're all comfortable? It's 3:30. He, of course, left office in March of 61, and he and Mamie retired to his farm in Gettysburg, and he lived there very comfortably up until he died in 69, but up until the beginning of 1968. He would occasionally be consulted, first by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, then by President Johnson in connection with whether to escalate to Vietnam or not. By the way, my own speculation is that if Eisenhower had been in charge of that decision, we would not have escalated. His theory had always been you either go in with everything you need to win, or you don't go in at all, and you only go in if it directly impacts the national security of the United States. And my own guess is that he would have seen Vietnam as a sidelight and not worth going into. But hang on just a second, because we're running so short of time. I apologize, Art, but we are so short of time. He endorsed the Republican nominees, but most of the time he stayed in the background, played golf, had a reasonably comfortable life. And then at the beginning of '68, his health deteriorated dramatically. He had a series of heart attacks. And he spent the last 10 months of his life in Walter Reed Military Hospital, having, again, more and more heart attacks. There are two versions of his last day. The people who were in the room, in his hospital room, were Mamie and his son John and his grandson David and the doctor. One historian says, and both historians that I'm talking about had direct access to his son John and to his grandson David in writing their histories. One historian says that what happened was that the day before he died, he told John to tell his doctors, take me off life support. I can't bear going on this week, W-E-A-K, and constantly having emergency measures because he was having heart attack after heart attack. And that they took him off life support the very day he asked, and the next day he died. The other historian who footnotes David, and obviously had personal discussion with David about it, says that on that last day, he said to his son and grandson, pull me up. And they pulled him up and put pillows behind him. And he said to them, I'm ready to go. Pull down the shades. Pull down the shades. It's time. I want to go now. And the historian then writes, and the doctor administered a sedative, and a few minutes later, he died. Now, whether you know, there are sedatives and there are sedatives. All I would say to you, and I'll come to you in a second, all I'll say to you is, it wouldn't surprise me if he was the commander-in-chief right up to the end. This guy wanted to be in charge of his life and did what he felt should be done. So it's kind of interesting in light of a lot of other things. Now, I have to ask you a favor, madam. We need to reserve this time for the report card and then for you guys to talk, because I myself can't make up my own mind about the report card. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why in advance, so you'll see. There are some things that occurred during Eisenhower's administration that were very, very good, but I'm reluctant to give him credit for it, as you'll see in a moment. If you gave him credit for everything that occurred that was good, you might give him a lot of A's. And I don't give him a lot of A's because I think there are things that occurred that even though the Eisenhower administration was responsible for it, he wasn't. And you can, believe me, disagree with me. So, keeping America out of war, A+. Absolutely A+. Secretly overthrowing foreign governments that he found distasteful, I give him an F. I think it's the worst thing he did, and the precedents that have flowed from that, I think are just dreadful beyond belief. That's my personal opinion. Managing U.S.-Soviet relations, a B+. I would have given him an A, but for the Francis Gary Powers incident, which he caused by being greedy about getting one more flight squeezed in before the 56 summit meeting. He was just greedy, that's all. And also his open skies proposal, which he, at the earlier summit, which he proposed by surprise with no diplomatic preparation. So, surprise, surprise, the Russians, completely floored, said no. And that was just a big mistake. They probably would have said no anyway, because they weren't about to let the world understand how weak Russia was in the first half of the 50s. But overall, I think that his management of Soviet-American relations was pretty good. Managing other foreign affairs generally, speaking of the rest of the world, I think he did pretty well. He was a big proponent of multilateral treaties and of being on good relations with the rest of the world. The only reason I give him an A- is he really didn't understand the third world neutral nations, you know, the Nehrus of India, Sukarno of Indonesia. Who is the third guy?
Nasser.
Nasser of Egypt. Thank you, Phil. He didn't get that you could actually be neutral in his world. So I give him an A-, but really pretty good. Opposing McCarthy and McCarthyism? D. This was a man who knew how to speak out when he wanted to. And he didn't. He chose not to.
Why not an F?
Yeah, why not?
I'll tell you why. He did do certain things. You could argue, late in the game. When McCarthy finally went after the army, he put his foot down. And he was very effective in shutting off the flow of information to McCarthy. And he met several times with Senate leaders in which he essentially told them, this is late in the game. Look, I know it's none of my business. The Senate is your institution. But I will not stand in the way if you feel that it's time to kiss McCarthy goodbye. And that helped, particularly on the Republican side, that helped. Far too little, too late. You could argue for an F, but I give him a D. Supporting civil rights, I give him this was one I changed my mind 11 times on. I gave him a C. This is an example. He appointed Earl Warren. But he appointed Earl Warren believing he was appointing a conservative Republican governor. In a million years, he did not dream that Earl Warren was going to become the great liberal progressive Chief Justice of the 20th century. He had no idea. And it was Warren who wrote those decisions and organized those majorities, not Eisenhower. So I don't give him a lot of credit for appointing Warren, despite the fact that wonderful results came from it. When he sent in troops to Little Rock, that had a powerful impact on the whole South. But he didn't send them in because he was in favor of the civil rights of those 9 black teenagers who wanted to go to Central High. He sent them in because he understood that he had to support the orders of a federal court that were being violated by a southern state governor. He understood very plainly that he had to support the federal supremacy of federal law. And he was also incredibly ticked off that Faubus double-crossed him. As I said in the last lecture, you don't double-cross the commander-in-chief. Oh yeah? Well, watch this. And here comes the 101st Airborne. There's a huge difference between that and actually being in favor of those children going safely and securely into Central High. So I give him a C. The reason I was tempted to give him a B was because he appointed Brownell as his Attorney General, knowing that Brownell was a liberal Eastern Republican, knowing that Brownell was a strong advocate of civil rights, and he let Brownell send the 1957 Civil Rights Bill to Congress, despite the fact that Ike undermined it by saying, oh, this is not an Eisenhower administration bill, this is a Brownell bill, which was, you know, another form of lunacy. But he did do it. He let Brownell take the lead, and he appointed Brownell. So he gets some credit for that. Managing the U.S. economy, I don't think he knew much about economics when he came into office, and he benefited by the fact that the period from 48 to the early 60s was a period of enormous economic expansion for the United States. But I think he did a pretty good job of at least staying out of the way. And he understood that when a recession looks like it's coming, the government should do some big things to create jobs. And he did do that. So I give him an A-, despite the fact that I don't think he ever took Economics 101. You know, it doesn't matter what his scholarly appreciation of it was. What did he do? Well, he did some very good things. Preserving the New Deal. I give him an A+. I give him an absolute A+. And between my first entry, Keeping America Out of War, and my last entry, Preserving the New Deal, I'm a lot more favorable or favorably inclined about Eisenhower than I was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. Successful president or moral failure? That's the title of this course. Well, both. When it came to civil liberties and civil rights, you know, he was a failure. When it came to so many other issues, he was very, very successful. And I'll read this for the members out in TV land who can't see the screen. A gifted, complex man who brought enormous experience and expertise to the presidency, but who, like virtually everyone, had critical gaps in his personal knowledge and experience, which led to occasional flawed decisions that, coming from an American president, had significant repercussions. So overall, what I say is pretty darn good. Could have been a lot better, not great, but on the whole, a positive force. Kept us out of war, preserved the New Deal, and moved the country forward, which is a judgment that I wouldn't have made the day I graduated from high school. It's a judgment I wouldn't have made the day I graduated from college or law school. It's a judgment I've really come to over the last, year or two or three. Maybe I'm getting senile in my old age. So, we have some time. Let's take them one at a time. Let's not just all shout out. Raise your hand. So the reason for raising hands is and having me call on you is so everybody can hear you. Who wants? We don't need to hear from people who agree with me. Let's hear from people who really disagree with me on keeping America out of war. Right there.
You actually missed one. You got a little bit on public health with the Salk vaccine, but it was a D or F on things like family planning, which you absolutely wouldn't touch until much later.
Good point. In fact, it's a good point for two reasons. Number one, it's 100% accurate. It's a very good point. Number two, on health and family planning issues, he wouldn't go near it, and for obvious political reasons. But it reminds me to remind you guys again that even though we've spent 12 hours and covered a lot of ground, what this gentleman just pointed out was an area that I didn't touch, and there are a lot of areas I haven't touched. Yes, sir. Art.
In terms of keeping America out of war, he did. However, when he was advising Johnson about continuing to pump additional forces into Vietnam, he was very forceful and very positive in those recommendations. And Johnson took him very seriously. He took his advice very seriously.
That's an interesting, fascinating subject. I disagree with you a little, Art, in terms of what he said. But let's stick to this. Anybody want to argue that keeping America out of war wasn't a positive? Yes, sir. Bob.
Well, you gave him an F because you don't like it, but he did it very well. Right? He got an A for execution.
Overthrowing government.
How about yeah. Oh, you're talking about the second, overthrowing governments. Yeah, well, just remember that he 90% owns the Bay of Pigs. It was all wrapped up in bows and ribbons and handed to Kennedy. Kennedy is entirely at fault for not understanding what it was going to take to succeed and for not understanding that it was dead wrong. But I have a lot of trouble with this. I mean, I got it. How about managing Soviet-U.S. relations? Anybody think? Leaving aside the lunacy of nuclear brinksmanship, if you leave that aside, everybody comfortable with that? How about foreign affairs generally? All right?
Yeah, Stacy?
Yeah.
I think you gave him much too good a grade for foreign affairs. Because I think, as it was just stated, he basically got us was responsible 90% for the Bay of Pigs. He was responsible for us getting involved in Southeast Asia and eventually into Vietnam, because he backed the French financially, and then he took over after that disastrous Dien Bien Phu incident. He wound up involving America in that war.
Yes, in
And the other
fact-
thing is he obstructed the British and French
That's-
at the Suez
Yeah.
when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. He actually instructed our Treasury Department to manipulate the foreign currencies to almost bankrupt England.
Correct.
To force them to pull out.
Correct.
And then he wound up taking Nasser's good faith word that he would keep the Gulf of Aqaba open in order to get the Israelis to pull out of Sinai in '56, which of course they didn't keep their word, and that precipitated the Six-Day War in '67.
These are all good points. I happen to think that he was dead right to oppose the British-French invasion of Egypt. I don't think you invade a country because you disagree with how they're handling a natural resource like the Suez. But that's a whole other discussion. The place where I think you're righter than even maybe you think is the biggest mistake he made, and it was a conscious choice of Dulles and him together, was when they reached a settlement brokered by Russia, the United States, Great Britain, and France to get France out of Indochina. In Vietnam, part of the deal was that in '56 they were supposed to have an election. And that was all part of the treaty or the agreement that settled the French withdrawal. And Eisenhower backed out of that agreement, supposedly because Dulles told him that if we hold the election, Ho Chi Minh is going to win it, hands down, and this communist is going to be the president of the whole country. They should have let the election go forward, and that was a terrible failure on his part.
It seemed like we kept supporting military dictatorships.
It seemed like we did. Absolutely.
In promoting
You're
democracy.
righter, Phil, you are righter than rain. Yes, ma'am.
I think the other thing that he did, which was insane, was to build thousands of nuclear weapons when no one had them.
Yes.
And when
You're so right. Can everybody hear?
When Kennedy became president, he was flabbergasted that we had this kind of an arsenal. And it's, insanity.
Yeah, to be very precise, let me just finish. Kennedy came into office thinking we had something like 2,000 nuclear weapons. We had 20,000 nuclear weapons, enough to destroy the Earth and 20,000 other Earths. You're absolutely right. And on that, I forget where you would put it, but on that issue, I changed my mind 11 times because you're 100% right. He really started the nuclear arms race, and it should have come as no surprise that the Soviets spent a fortune trying to keep up with us, and they never did, really. Yes, sir.
The element of the Aswan Dam, I think, was very important at that time in cementing closer relationships with Egypt. Egypt wanted to, needed support, they didn't have enough money to build the Aswan Dam. And they asked the United States, and the United States refused. I have to have patience.
In fact, it's worse. It's worse. The United States first said yes and then reneged.
I have the Undersecretary of State under John Foster Dulles as a patient of mine. And I asked him about the Aswan Dam because I thought that was a terrible mistake on their part. And as a result, the Russians came in, they funded it and sent in their engineers to help them build it.
You're 100% right. You're 100% right. This lady right here.
Yes, I think this comes both under Soviet relations and foreign affairs. That was the uprising in Hungary. That encouragement for the Eastern Europeans to rise up. And then when they did, they got no help. And I think that encouraged the Soviets in imposing even further.
And I think that the moral failure underlying that is really devastating. It's really devastating. It was wrong to encourage them to begin with because he knew that we weren't going to go in and create World War III in Eastern Europe. He knew that. Anybody want to disagree with me about opposing McCarthy and McCarthyism? How about on civil rights? Anybody got a different view of civil rights? You know, a lot of people give him full credit for appointing Earl Warren as if he knew what Earl Warren was going to do. But a lot of people give him credit for that. And there's a lot of misunderstanding, which is excusable, because he was pretty careful about talking about it, about why exactly he sent in troops to Little Rock. He had previously, by the way, very early in his administration, when none of this was on the table, he said, I would never send troops in to a southern state. Never! And then Faubus figured out the one way to motivate him to do it. Yes, sir.
Just a little issue, and that's, think what was going through his mind as a military man, and being brought up with a tradition of separation of military and non-military, to go ahead and send military in on a civil matter. I don't think that was an easy decision for him.
Very hard, very hard. And also, remember, he had a lot of close friends in that gang of his who were Southerners, deep South Southerners. Ladies and gentlemen, we've gone over time. I think that the points you've made are very, very valid and highlight how difficult it is to measure overall his impact. That's why pretty darn good, could have been a lot better, on the whole a positive force. You could disagree with that. You could definitely disagree with that. Maybe he seems pretty darn good when you compare him with what President Robert Taft and the country would have looked like. So, let me thank you all for sticking with me. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.